Morning. We are in the middle of halacha Zion, halacha 9 of chapter 271 in the Alter Shulchan Aruch, Siman Reish, Ayin Aleph, laws of Kiddush. So we established in the beginning of halacha Tes is this prohibition against eating or drinking from the moment the obligation of Kiddush sets in until one makes Kiddush. The obligation for Kiddush can set in either one of two ways, either because the world brings upon you that obligation because Shabbos begins, or specifically the beginning of Benish Mashas nightfall, sunset, which is like the earliest time Shabbos could possibly come in, and that in its natural manner, right? So from that point forward, no eating or drinking until Kiddush. Or option B is if a person davened Ma'ariv early and he took upon himself Shabbos early, from that point forward, he could not eat or drink until he made Kiddush. And we explained that this is different than the ordinary rabbinic prohibition against eating or drinking prior to fulfilling a mitzvah that is set in a certain time, Shema in the morning or any other. And the reason is because in all of these mitzvahs, the concern is you may be drawn by your meal, and therefore you might forget your obligation. And therefore, the prohibition is only against eating a full meal that might draw you in. But a snack or a cup of water, good. It's not you're not gonna drink a cup of water for the next hour and a half and therefore forget your Shema. You have a cup of water and you say Shema. But your meal might drag on. When it comes to the Kiddush Friday night, and likewise Havdalah on Saturday night, where even though there's let's say 24-hour time frame for your obligation from the beginning of Shabbos to the end of Shabbos, but nonetheless, the obligation itself says, please fulfill me as early as possible. So there actually is, even from the mitzvah's perspective, preference to being fulfilled early. And as such, it goes beyond simply, we're afraid you're going to get drawn into your meal and forget your obligation. But actually, we don't want you to delay your obligation by anything. And if we don't do anything until you're done, you make your obligation, even a little sip of water. And therefore, the prohibition against eating prior to Kiddush, from when the moment Kiddush obligation sets in, is more stringent than other such prohibitions. This is the frame, the basis upon which we're going to build the rest of the halachas, going through halacha 12, which again is all built on our Gemara and Psachim. So let's see. So it's the third paragraph in halacha tes. Now, you see it there?
Yeah.
Third paragraph in halacha tes. Even if a person began to eat or drink while it's still day, so he did so prior to the onset of the obligation, and therefore there is no prohibition in that eating. Right, this is what we learned in the Gemara a while back. Remember,
right.
That was actually the original discussion in the Gemara. That was the original
class too.
Sorry. Yesterday. Yeah, a little bit. So this was actually the original discussion in Gemara and Psachim. Right? The Gemara and Psachim began this whole discussion because it said that on Erev Pesach you may not eat so you can have an appetite for matzah. To which the Gemara did a comparison to what would be on a regular Friday afternoon, and there launched a whole discussion on Kiddush. Right? So this was really the original discussion in Psachim. So now the person began to eat and drink before Shabbos. And it's not like Erev Pesach where you may not eat before. It's an Erev Shabbos. You're allowed to eat and drink. The obligation for Kiddush hasn't set in yet. You're sitting down to a meal, no problem. But now the obligation comes upon you. What do? She explains, Tzarech lahafsik, one has to stop in the middle of his meal. As soon as sunset arrives. Right? It says in footnote 39, this comes from the Gemara Psachim 100a, our Gemara. Okay, so the minute sunset comes in, one has to stop and make Kiddush. There are others that actually are of the view that you wait till nightfall when it's absolute time of Shabbos, not the doubt time of Shabbos. The doubt that it says you stop at sunset, the beginning of Benish Mashas, at the beginning of that time period. Yeah. Okay, now it continues. Continuing with the comparison against the prohibition of eating before other mitzvahs that are time-bound versus eating before making Kiddush. Right? So stringency number one with regard to Kiddush was that when it comes to Kiddush, you may not even drink water. You may not even do anything once the obligation becomes. Now here's a second stringency with regard to the way in which we treat Kiddush versus other mitzvahs. It explains. The afalpi, even though shebashar kol mitzvahs, when it comes to other mitzvahs, afilu shel Torah, even biblical mitzvahs. Im hisra beheter, if you began your meal, right? So you're not allowed to eat a full meal before Shema in the morning, let's say, because you might be drawn into your meal and forget the Shema. But if you began your meal prior to the onset of the obligation of Shema, you see, started in the middle of the night. Right? That is to say, prior to when the mitzvah's obligation is set in, ain't tzarich lahafsik, you don't have to stop. But Shabbos night, you say you do have to stop your meal for Kiddush. So another difference between the prohibition against eating before Kiddush versus the prohibition against eating for other mitzvahs. The prohibition against eating for other mitzvahs is number one, only for a full meal that might draw you in and make you forget. And B, if you started at a time when you were allowed to, you started before the onset of the mitzvah, then you're not required to stop.
Even if it goes beyond the time of that mitzvah?
Correct. Even if it goes into the time when that mitzvah starts. Okay, you still have to, as we'll see soon, you still have to calculate, can I finish my meal in time to fulfill the mitzvah afterwards? Yeah, that's for sure. But I'm not required to stop the moment the mitzvah sets in. Right? As he says, and we times that for this reason, as well, you're not required to stop a meal you're not required to stop mid-meal for Shema or davening when the obligation sets in. So you started. Different. That's right. Nonetheless, the Kiddush Hayom, when it comes to the Kiddush of Shabbos day, not Shabbos day, sanctifying the day of Shabbos, that is Friday night Kiddush, he was not granted permission to finish his meal, to make the Kiddush afterwards.
Didn't we learn different opinions?
We had three different opinions in the Gemara. One which said you have to bench now and make Kiddush. One which said continue your meal, no problem, make Kiddush after. Yeah. And the third opinion which says stop mid-meal, make Kiddush. And we follow the third opinion, which is what we're doing here. That's right. Now, so what's the reason? The fee, she'ikir Kiddush, the primary Kiddush, nitkan, has been established, the Makoyim Sudash Shabbos. To be done, the Kiddush has been established to be done in the place of your Shabbos meal, the Kodim law, and prior to your meal, to begin your meal, to begin the meal with Shabbos, to begin your meal with Kiddush, and not after your meal is over. Shenemar, as the verse reads, the Karasa l'Shabbos Oneg, the verse reads in Yeshayahu in Isaiah, you shall call out to the Shabbos that it be a day of delight. So Gedorshu Chachamim, our sages, derived, these sages are the commentaries on our Gemara and Psachim, which derived the Makom Oineg, in the place of your delight, that is to say, the place where you delight in your Shabbos meal, there shall be the calling out to Shabbos in the beginning, right? The pasuk reads, "The karas the Shabbos onik." You should call out to the Shabbos a day of delight. So the slip reading of the verse is, you should feel Shabbos as a day of delight. But the way that the verse phrases it is, you shall call out to Shabbos a day of delight, as if to say, first call out to Shabbos, Kiddush, and then enjoy your delight, your meal. The karas the Shabbos onik. You shall call out to the Shabbos your delight. So as you begin to delight in your Shabbos, your meal, the karas of the Shabbos, you got to call out to the Shabbos, making Kiddush. Follow? It's a derivative of the verse. So now, because the Kiddush has been established to be prior to your Shabbos meal, and you're in the middle of eating a meal here, if we let you finish and make Kiddush at the end, then you'd be making Kiddush at the end of your meal, not the beginning. But
you would be doing another meal.
Another meal.
Yeah, that was a meal prior to Kiddish's obligation started. Then you make bench, and then you make Kiddush, and then you have.
And then have a follow-up meal. It's maybe it's possible to do that, but that would be.
You may not have appetite though.
Not just appetite, not just lack of appetite. It's also like, it's like turning it into a joke.
Yeah, for sure.
And if you're benching and making Kiddush and washing again, why didn't you do that 2 hours ago in the middle of your meal? Like,
that's true.
It's a little bit of a joke, right? it would certainly have the appearance of you just finished enjoying yourself and now you're making Kiddush.
Right.
Right. So, and that's not the way that's not the way Kiddush is meant to be fulfilled. Okay, so you got to stop your meal, right? But you don't have to stop it completely. That was the Kiddush of the third view.
Oh yes.
Right. You remember we learned from the Rashbam.
Right.
I'm not sure if you remember we learned this third opinion. We learned from the Rashbam that this third opinion actually follows the view that you have to stop to make Kiddush.
You cover the bread.
But he suggested you don't have to stop the meal completely.
No, you continue.
Right, because remember that third opinion, which said continue the meal, just cover the bread. That third opinion was a sage from the Gemara's era, whereas the other two scholars, one which said to stop your meal completely, and one which said continue to finish, was Tanoim, were sages of the Mishnah. So how is it possible for a sage of the Gemara to argue? So Rashbam explained that actually he's following the opinion which says you got to stop your meal, but he's telling you don't have to stop your meal completely. You just have to cover the bread. Right, because he's of the view that the Kiddush has to be before the meal, not after the meal. Right, that's what Alter is about to do here. If I'm not mistaken, even the footnotes here. Yeah, he puts the footnotes. And does he put Rashbam? I don't see if he puts Rashbam. But he puts our Gemara in Psachim. At any rate,
so the way he ties the Gemara's now. Thank you.
Correct.
By saying
really
not stopping the meal completely. You are
it.
stopping it, so you are
Correct.
in accordance with
Tanaim. That's right. You're in accordance with the Tanaim, which are of the view that you may not eat your meal without making Kiddush.
Right. So stopping satisfies.
But you're stopping to satisfy it, but you don't have to completely stop. Is the point?
You don't have to batch meal.
Correct. That's what it says. Nevertheless, you don't need to stop your meal completely and do benching. Tamshi is bar for reasons that will be explained soon in subsection 14. We're in subsection 9. We're in halacha 9. Halacha Yud Beis is going to explain it. Right? Yeah, and we'll see soon why. Because it doesn't cost you to break in your meal and so on. Ella, rather, what should you do? Yikadesh miyad. You make Kiddush right away, as soon as the time comes, as soon as the sun sets. And then finish your meal. And then, and in this way, your Kiddush is being done in the meal that's following it, because you're still continuing the meal. In other words, the moment Shabbos obligation hit, you make Kiddush and had a meal. Even though that meal started as a Kiddush, exactly. But still, your Kiddush was done in the presence of a Shabbos meal that you're about to do. Now, and therefore, so this, you see how the Alter phrases it? He breaks it down. In other words, first and foremost, you have to stop your meal for Kiddush. You don't need to stop it completely. And then in a separate halacha, he talks about covering the bread. Because the point here isn't covering the bread and making Kiddush. The point here is stopping your meal to make Kiddush. Now, by the way, because you're doing it, you got to cover your bread. Right? That's what he says in Palach Yud. You have to spread a cloth over the table in order to cover the bread. He puts in footnote 46. All that must be covered, however, are the 2 loaves required for Lechem Mishnah. Pieces of bread that are on the table need not be covered. It's just those 2 loaves of bread which you have to have for Lechem Mishnah. So you have to cover the bread before you make Kiddush. That way it doesn't bring any shame to the bread, right? Mm-hmm. And he said in footnote 45, there is no obligation to recite the evening service before reciting Kiddush. You can daven later.
Yeah, sorry, can you repeat that?
There's no obligation to daven Ma'ariv before Kiddush. That you can do later. He puts that in footnote 45.
Oh, that's interesting. No, that's what I had to do.
Yeah, it happens sometimes where family arrangements are such that you have to daven Ma'ariv after. So when you do that, you have to appoint someone else to remind you, because you have the issue of lest I forget, which is the other issue. Right, so you appoint someone to remind you. That's right. So you appoint someone else to remind you, and then that's okay. So now that you're stopping your meal for Kiddush, because you have to have Kiddush prior to your meal, not after, and so you have to cover the bread, not to bring it shame. So you cover the 2 loaves. But after his Kiddush, he said, "No, he can uncover his bread." What purpose? So that it gives the appearance that the bread arrived at the table now as a result of your Kiddush in honor of Shabbos by having the bread covered and then uncovered. So it's more than just the ordinary time not to shame the bread.
So they give the appearance that.
But it gives the appearance that this bread is here now thanks to Shabbos. And therefore it's Lechem Mishnah. I just, it's 2 loaves of bread.
It's not a carryover from
exactly.
the previous.
So that's right. So I'm making Kiddush, uncover the bread, and there's a new bread eating ceremony type thing in honor of the Kiddush I just made for Shabbos.
Okay. So if someone was eating a meal prior to the onset of Kiddush, Shabbos, so if they didn't, they would have to bring out 2 fresh new loaves if they don't.
For Lechem Mishnah. That's right. You have to bring out 2 fresh new loaves for Lechem Mishnah. Now here's the amazing thing. Let's still go further. This is an unbelievable, beautiful halacha, which is not directly derived from our Gemara and Psachim, but in some ways it plays in. But it comes from elsewhere. As he puts in the footnote here, it comes from the Yerushalmi. I think it is. Okay. Now, partially also from our Gemara. One does not need to make hagafen on the cup of his kiddush. This we learned. Even if he already made a bracha hagafen during this meal. So this meal that he started before Shabbos started included wine. So he made hagafen already. So now when he's making kiddush, he doesn't need to make hagafen. Okay. Why? The wine of his kiddush has been covered by the bracha he made on the wine he drank earlier. Likewise, the wine that he's going to keep on drinking during the meal after his kiddush does not need to be. You don't need to make a bracha on that either for the same reason, because it was covered by your original bracha hagafen. Right? So you're picking up a cup of wine, saying a mashishi, skipping baruch atah Hashem baruch pegafen, and going right through baruch atah Hashem baruch mechalam, straight to the kiddush bracha. Okay. Likewise, if you're stopping your meal and you're not making kiddush on wine, you're making kiddush on bread. So in this case, you're not covering the bread because you're making kiddush on bread. You're picking up, let's say, 2 loaves and making kiddush.
Oh, you mean when you started your meal?
You started your meal earlier. You're stopping now to make kiddush, but you have no wine, so you're making kiddush on bread.
Oh, you don't have wine.
That's right.
And you didn't drink
and you didn't drink it. You don't.
Your meal.
You don't have your meal. You don't have wine. I'm sorry. The whole meal was wine. Was a wine-free meal.
Wine-free meal. So now you're making kiddush.
Now you're making kiddush on bread.
Okay.
So ein tzarich levarach hamoitzi. You don't have to make hamoitzi on that bread.
You don't have to make hamoitzi
because you already started hamoitzi earlier.
All right. Yeah.
You're in the middle of a meal. You start from start with the bracha of kiddush. So far, it's clear. The bracha of kiddush is different than the bracha of the enjoyment of either the wine or the bread. Right? That's birchas hanehenin. That's a bracha of enjoyment. You've already begun to enjoy your bread, so no bracha on the bread upon which you're making kiddush. You've already begun to enjoy wine. If that's the case, then no reason to make a bracha on the hagafen on the wine that you're drinking now for kiddush. Now here comes the anomaly. So far clear?
Wait, but you still have to make a bracha for if you drink wine during the meal.
If you haven't drinking wine yet. If you haven't drinking wine yet.
Yeah.
But if you have wine coming later in the meal, you have to wait for that one to make kiddush. Because you have to give preference to wine over bread, at least according to most opinions. Right? So obviously this guy has no bread or no wine at all.
No wine. Clearly.
Let's just assume that that's the case to make it simpler. Because if he knows he has wine coming, it complicates it. Maybe he should be waiting for wine. Let's leave that alone for now. Let's just assume there's no wine period.
No wine. So he already had bread, so he doesn't.
So that's right.
So he just makes the Yom HaShishi.
Yom HaShishi and Baruch Hashem L'Chalam, the bracha of kiddush.
I think he would still have to cover the bread, though, right?
I don't think so. Why have to cover the bread?
Because for the reason
of making it appear that this is a new. Maybe you're right. Maybe you have to cover the bread, just to maybe. That's a good point. Maybe perhaps I don't see anything here, but maybe. Okay, now here comes the interesting part. This is the anomaly. If he went back to the first scenario, where he made kiddush in a cup of wine mid-meal, which means he made no bracha hagafen. He picked up a cup of wine and all he did was straight to the bracha of kiddush.
Oh, he didn't. Oh, okay.
So he washed already because he started before Shabbos started.
Yeah.
He had a meal. He's eating bread. He's mid-meal and the sun sets. He picks up a cup of wine to make kiddush. Now, he has to now make hamoitzi on the kiddush, on the wine, on the bread he's about to have after the kiddush. even though he ate bread earlier. So it's a strange thing. If I'm making Kiddush on bread,
what do you make? He's not making Kiddush on bread. He's making it on the wine.
It's right. So if I made Kiddush on bread,
no
bracha on motzi on that bread. It's covered by the bread I ate earlier.
Yeah.
But if I make Kiddush on challah, if I make Kiddush on wine, then the challah that follows afterwards I have to make a motzi on. Isn't that funny?
Even if you made hamotzi.
Even though you made hamotzi earlier. What's the rationale? It's a very interesting phenomenon.
Yeah.
Now this is going to get into a very involved and intricate topic that actually has relevance to Pesach, as we'll learn when we get there, the Seder night, which is as follows. Let's read the Shulchan Aruch here. Hoyel, considering ubishas amidas hakiddush, while the person was reciting Kiddush over his cup of wine, he is forbidden and he's not allowed to eat anything. Because it's impossible for him to speak the words of Kiddush and eat simultaneously. And because there was a moment in which I was not allowed to eat bread and incapable of eating bread, therefore, it's considered a break in my meal and I have to make a new bracha afterwards. This gets back to halachas we discussed way earlier, right? Which is when there's a break in your meal, you have to make a bracha again hamotzi, even though you didn't mention the first one, right? Like if you left the room, depending on the circumstances, not always, depending on the circumstances, right? So if there's a break in your meal, if your meal is officially over, even if you didn't bench, you just make a bracha hamotzi again. So what's the Alter Rebbe saying? If I made Kiddush on bread, my meal didn't end. No reason to make hamotzi again on the bread. But when I make Kiddush on wine, because during that time I may not be eating bread and I can't eat bread because I'm talking, I can't eat at the same time, that constitutes a break in my meal and therefore new hamotzi afterwards.
Why are we singling out wine? I mean, you're saying
that's a good question.
That also could be deemed a break in the meal because you're talking, you can't be eating.
Very, very good question. So this is such a funny halacha. Now, the principle is that if in the middle of a meal I end up in a place where somehow I can't eat or I'm not allowed to eat, that constitutes a break. And now we have to examine: is that true universally? Is it true universally that if I do something that causes me not to be able to eat during my meal, if my meal is over? Classic example, as we learned this already, when we learned the halachas of Kufayin Ches 178, which was if you're davening in the middle of your meal, you can continue eating afterwards without making a new bracha. And during davening, you're not allowed to eat. You can't eat while you're davening.
Yeah.
So why, when it comes to the Kiddush over wine, that does constitute as a break, and Kiddush over bread doesn't constitute as a break?
Yeah.
What's going on? How do I qualify this? Now, for this comes the next couple paragraphs, and let's focus, because it's going to be a lot of different details. So let's first begin by comparing it to davening. Yeah? The Ein Adoima. This should not be compared. You see the paragraph there?
You're still on line?
We're middle of 10 right now. 11, sorry, the third paragraph in 11. The Ein Adoima. The Ein Adoima. This should not be compared. The mispalel be'en pesudasoi to one who davens mid-meal. She'ein tfilasoi, his prayer is not chashuva, constitute hefsik, a interruption, latinoi, to require him to then go back and make hamotzi again al pashiyach la'achakach, for the bread he eats afterwards. Right, so that we learned this already in Kufayin Ches in 178, that if a person's in the middle of his meal and he has to run daven with a minion, he comes back, continues his meal, no problem. Because he hasn't finished his meal yet. Why? Here's the key. Because in addition to the fact, there's one issue when it comes to Kiddush, is that while I'm talking, I can't eat. And that's true for davening also. I'm davening, I'm talking, I can't eat. But there's another issue. When it comes to Kiddush, during that Kiddush time, I'm not allowed to eat until I make Kiddush. Kiddush says you may not halachically eat. In addition to the fact that while I'm talking, I can't eat. But when it comes to davening, the time of davening does not compel him not to eat. If he wanted to, he could have kept on eating during that time when he's davening and davened after. When it comes to Kiddush, the moment Kiddush obligation comes on, Kiddush declares, stop eating. And A. B, while you're doing that obligation, you can't eat. Thus, it's a break in your meal. When it comes to davening, technically it's true I cannot eat while I'm davening. But davening didn't tell me, hey, stop eating. assuming I began my meal earlier when I was allowed to, before the obligation for davening came. Now the obligation of davening arrives. The obligation of davening doesn't say, hey, stop eating. If I want to, I can continue davening, continue eating, and daven later. So the time of davening doesn't say stop eating.
And like Shema.
Like Shema, same thing. That's right. The Shema doesn't say stop eating. Kiddush says stop eating, and therefore constitutes a break. We still have to explain.
But we still have to explain
why when you're making
when you're making it on bread.
On bread, we'll get to that in a second.
Yeah,
we'll get there. We will get there. That's very good. But now we're starting to broaden the picture. Yeah. Now continues. Now, even if he's in a scenario where his meal is such that if he were to continue his meal and finish, he would miss the time frame of davening. Right? He's required not to stop and daven. And he may not eat anymore until he does. You would think so. The prohibition here is only not to eat a settled permanent meal, lest you get drawn in the Yavaz Mantfila in the time of prayer. Stop. But tasting would have been permitted for him now. At that very time when he's davening.
It's not really considered.
And therefore, the prayer doesn't completely stop his davening, his eating. Because davening says, in theory, you can snack now.
Right. So it's not a break per se.
That's right. Moreover, says Alter Rebbe in the parentheses, moreover, the prohibition against eating is only because the time of davening has now arrived. And then afterwards you can go back to your settled meal. But when it comes to Kiddush, here, you were told stop eating. Why? Because your Kiddush has to be prior to your meal. When it comes to davening, you weren't told stop because davening has to come before meal. You were told stop because you may miss it. Because your timing is no good. You may miss it, but not because davening says, hey, put me first. But when it comes to Kiddush, Kiddush says, hey, put me first. Yeah. Right? So Kiddush, in other words, has an opinion about your meal. Davening doesn't have an opinion about your meal. Davening says, just do me in the right time frame. It so happens your meal is now, okay, so break in your meal. But I have no opinion on your meal. First of all, you can continue if you had time to do me after.
Yeah.
Even if you didn't have time to do me after, you can continue snacking. And whatever, I have no opinion on your meal, says davening.
Just not to forget.
You just don't forget. And if it so happens that you have no other choice, you'll stop and daven. But I have no opinion on your meal. But Kiddush says, I have an opinion about your meal. You may not eat A, B, you're supposed to be after me. Right? And therefore, here, eating was prohibited because Kiddush says you have to be after me. And I should not be coming after you. Commotion is bar, as we explained earlier. Okay, and therefore, the Kiddush itself declares a separation between the eating before Kiddush and the eating afterwards. When he eats after his Kiddush, it's considered like a different meal that has been now sanctified by the Kiddush. Whereas your meal post-davening wasn't sanctified by your davening. It just, you have to have interrupted for your davening, but your davening has no opinion on your meal. This parenthesis seems to be Alter Rebbe's Chiddush because it's in parentheses, and it's the most geschmack of them all. It ties all the different details together. The fact that you're allowed to continue eating, the fact that if you had time, you could do it afterwards. It all ties down to this essential point that Alter Rebbe is adding here, which is davening has no opinion on your meal. Kiddush does. Kiddush says, you belong after me, and therefore don't do anything until I'm done. And as such, Kiddush declares the separation. As it continues, Avakan, but here, Miyachi Giya, Zmana Kiddush, the moment the time for Kiddush arrives, first of all, you're not allowed to eat even anything. You can't even drink water. The Nasikil and Nigmer Kvarsadasa, and therefore it's considered as if your meal is done. Therefore, the recitation of Kiddush constitutes a break in your meal. Because, first of all, Kiddush has an opinion, halachic opinion about your meal, it says to stop. And while its opinion is being stated, you can't eat because you're talking. And he's saying Kiddush after the end of his previous meal, because Kiddush says, "Hey, I'm here. You have to have a meal after me, and while I'm being recited, you can't eat anything." So it's the halachic element plus the fact that I can't eat while I'm talking. Right? Okay, so we still have two more things to cover. We'll do this.
But we're still stuck with that issue, right? With the
Yeah, it's going to come up in a second. Okay, let's continue. We'll cover that. Aval bat, sorry.
No, you want it?
Yeah, we'll continue. Aval bat hayayin shel kiddush, the wine of kiddush, where we said before you're not making a new hagafen on your kiddush, right? If you're making wine,
because you don't have wine.
no, you don't make. Let's say you do have wine, and you're making kiddush mid meal on wine. We said already earlier, you don't make a bracha on that wine, right? Why? Why isn't that a break in your meal? You're making wine on. You're making hagafen on this wine because kiddush says you're not allowed to drink anything until I tell you. So why aren't you making a new hagafen on that kiddush when you make kiddush mid meal on the wine? For the same logic that you have to make a new hamotzi after the kiddush, right?
It's not considered a break.
Why not? I'm middle of the meal, sunset. I had wine earlier. I'm picking up now a cup of wine to make kiddush. Why am I not making a hagafen on that wine? Kiddush said, "Hey, you're not allowed to drink anything until you fulfill your obligation." Right? Did it not just end your meal? So it explains like this. Are you following the question?
Okay.
We just finished saying that Kiddush is an opinion about your meal. Kiddush says no eating, no drinking, no nothing until I'm done. And therefore, when you're done, make a new hamotzi because it's a new meal.
Make a new hamotzi.
Because it's a new meal. That's what we just finished saying. Right? Because Kiddush has an opinion on your meal and says, hey, stop.
I don't think that wine is considered part of the meal.
Why not? You're not allowed to drink any water even until Kiddush is done. So right now, if I'm mid-meal, sunset, I'm about to make Kiddush on wine. But we said earlier, you don't make a hagafen on that wine. Why not? If I had a hagafen earlier in the meal, right?
Right.
So why don't they make a hagafen? Seemingly, Kiddush declared no drinking wine until you're done with me. If that's the case, it's a break in the meal. I should be making a new hagafen. Yeah, so it says, aval bat, follow? Yeah or no? Yeah? Aval bat, in other words, if there's a break in your meal by the Kiddush, seemingly it breaks everything.
So then if it breaks everything,
then even your new wine,
you should have to say
a new hagafen on the wine upon which you're reciting Kiddush, because Kiddush just ended your entire meal before.
Yeah, and we're not here.
And you're not. You're only making a new hamotzi.
Only on why the difference.
Exactly. Exactly. This explains aval hayayin shel kiddush, the wine over which you're making kiddush. Afal pisha sheisei achar kiddush, even though you end up drinking it only after you recite the kiddush. Nonetheless, ein tzarich levarach alav. You don't need to make a new hagafen on that one. Why? Kivin shmizman berchasai. The halacha says, when should you make the bracha on wine?
First.
Oh, koidim amiras kiddush, before your kiddush. And at that point, your break hasn't come yet. The break comes in your kiddush, but the bracha of wine comes before your kiddush, and therefore you don't have to make it because your break in the meal hasn't come yet. So it's only and this explains why you make kiddush on hamotzi, you don't make another bracha hamotzi.
Right, but you would have if your wine came after.
Exactly. So it's only when you make the bracha of kiddush, which says your meal is done, and while you're saying the bracha you can't eat, that's when there's a break, and afterwards you make a new bracha. But exactly. So it stacks up perfectly. But the wine because the bracha of wine comes before your kiddush, it's before the break. And if you were making kiddush on hamotzi, that's also before your kiddush, and therefore also no break. And therefore, ironically,
no
new hamotzi. So ironically, if you make kiddush on wine, new hamotzi after you finish kiddush on wine. If you make kiddush on hamotzi, no new hamotzi at all.
And that perfectly aligned.
That's right.
The reasoning.
Correct. Yeah. Okay, we'll stop over here. He's going to give us some more rationale here that we're missing because even though, as we'll see, even though you're not required to make even though the hagafen comes before the kiddush, but still, seemingly, the halacha says you have to pick up a cup of wine, and that itself should stop your meal. We'll discuss that, and the same thing with bread, and then we're going to get into an opinion which disagrees with this entirely. Okay. Okay, wonderful day and a good Ner Shabbos. There's still another opinion, by the way. This is only opinion A. More coming. Okay. Wonderful day.